rounding whole numbers to 10, 100 and 1000. Rounding is when we make a number easier to work with without changing its value too much. So rounding is very useful when you're estimating and you just want a rough idea of what that number is. For example, if I wanted to have a rough idea of what 73 plus 21 is, I could round each number to the nearest 10 to give myself a rough estimate. So I could say, well, instead of doing the actual calculation, I'm going to round. So I'm going to say that the number 73 is roughly 70 and the number 21 is roughly 20. So instead I can just say, well, 70 plus 20 is 90, so that I know that my answer to 73 plus 21 is going to be near to 90. So how do I actually round a number? Well, when we round a number to the nearest 10, we're trying to find out which tens number it's nearest to. Let's take the number 73. So we need to think to ourselves, which tens number is 73 nearest to? Is it nearer to 70 or is it nearer to 80? The best way to do this is to draw ourselves a number line. Now I can mark the number 73 on my number line. It would go here. And I can see very easily that my number 73 is closer to 70 than it is to 80. So from this I can see that the number 73, if I round it to the nearest 10, would round to 70. But we don't really want to have to draw a number line every time we need to round a number, so there's another method we can use. If we're rounding to the nearest 10, then we need to look to the next digit after the tens. So in this case, this would be the units digit. This units digit tells us whether we need to round the number up to the next 10, we need to round up, or we need to stay at the original 10 we are. Our number line will show us how to do this. So we can see that if the units, so that's the next one after the tens, is a 5, a 6, a 7, an 8 or a 9, then we're going to round up to the next 10. But if the units digit is a 4, a 3, a 2 or a 1, we're going to keep the original 10 that we've got. So we're essentially, we say rounding down, but we're keeping that 10 as it is. So let's look at an example. Let's look at the number 64. Now, because I want to round to the nearest 10, I'm going to move to the next digit, which is the 4, the units digit. Let's look at our number line, and we can see that if the units is a 4, then we're keeping the original 10s we have already, which means we're going to be rounding, in this case, to 60, rather than rounding up to 70. So we can see that because the units digit is a 4, the number 64 gets rounded to 60. Okay, let's try another example. Let's look at the number 71. So we want to round 71 to the nearest 10, so we need to look at the next digit, which is the units, and then we can see from our number line that the number 1 means that we keep the tens number we already have. So 71 would be rounded to 70. So 71 rounds to 70. Let's try another example. Let's look at the number 48. So 48 we want to round to the nearest 10. So let's look at the next digit, which is the units, and it's 8 this time. So let's have a look at our number line. We can see that the number 8, well, this means that we need to round up. So the 10 we're on is 40, but we're going to round up, which means we're rounding up to 50, because 48 is closer to 50 than it is to 40. So 48 rounded to the nearest 10 is 50. What about the number 57 if we needed to round that to the nearest 10? Well, look at the units digit, it's a 7, and we know that if the units digit is a 5, a 6, a 7, an 8 or a 9, we round up. So that means that 57 is going to be rounded up to 60. So remember, look at the units digit, and if the units digit is a 1, a 2, a 3 or a 4, you round to the 10 that you already have. And if the units digit is a 5, a 6, 7, an 8 or a 9, you round up to the next 10. Okay, now it's your turn to pause the video and have a try at rounding these numbers to the nearest 10. How did you do? Let's have a look at the answers. So 31 rounded to the nearest 10 is 30. 26 rounded to the nearest 10 is 30. 92 rounded to the nearest 10 is 90. 78 rounded to the nearest 10 is 80. And 45 rounded to the nearest 10 is 50. The number 5 is the one that always gets people confused because it's right in the middle, but the 5 you always round up. Well, what about if I wanted to round a larger number to the nearest 10? Let's take, for example, the number 126, and I want to round this to the nearest 10. Well, first of all, I've got to think to myself, if I did have a number line, what would the nearest tens number, so the tens number, be either side of 126? So let's say 126 would be about here. If I go up to the next tens number, so forget about the 100 for a minute and just think, well, 26, I know it will be 30. So I know that 130 will be this end, and then this end will be 120. So I'm thinking, which of these is 126 closer to? And that way I've rounded to the nearest 10. So in the same way we did before, let's have a look at the next digit along, which is the units digit. That's going to give us the clue. So we can see that the units digit is a 6, and we know that if it's a 6, we round up. So I can see that 126 to the nearest 10 is 130. What about if we looked at the number 531? Okay, so 531, we need to round to the nearest 10, so I need to look at the next digit along, which is the units. Now it's a 1. Now that's going to tell me I need to round down. So if I've got 531, well, if I round down, I'm going to get to 530, because that's the nearest tens number, as opposed to 540. So I can see that 531 on my number line would fit about here. So I can see that it's closer to 530. So 531 rounded to the nearest 10 is 530. Okay, your turn to try a few, so pause the video and have a try at rounding these numbers to the nearest 10. Okay, how did you do? Let's have a look at the answers. So 628 rounded to the nearest 10 would take us to 630 because we look at the 8. 192 rounded to the nearest 10 is 190, so we look at the 2. And 555, well, we look at the 5 here, so that would round to 560. Okay, so now we understand how to round to the nearest 10, let's have a look at rounding to the nearest 100. Let's have a look at the number 462. Now I want to round 462 to the nearest 100. So because it's the 100 that I'm wanting to round to, I need to look at the next digit. And the next digit to the 100 is the 10. So the tens is the one that becomes important this time. So 462 to the nearest 100. So I need to think, well, what are the nearest hundreds numbers? So it will either be 400 or it will be 500. So is 462 nearer to 400 or nearer to 500? So if we draw ourselves another number line, I can see that 400 is going to be at one end and 500 is going to be at the other. So 450 is roughly going to be there, and then we'd have 10, 20, 30, 40, and then 60, 70, 80, 90. So roughly we can see that, well, this would be 440 here, this would be 460. So I'm looking at the number 462. So it's roughly going to be just after the 460, so it's roughly there. Now we can see, can't we, from this number line that this number is actually a little closer to 500 than it is to 400. So we can see that 462 rounded to the nearest 100 would be 500. And it works in the same way as when we were rounding to the nearest 10. We look at this digit here, which in this case is the tens digit, and we can see it's a 6. And we know from before that if our digit is 5, 6, 7, 8 or 9, we round up. And if our digit is 4, 3, 2, 1, we round down. Okay, let's try another question. Let's try 273. So we want to round 273 to the nearest 100. Well, first of all, which two numbers am I thinking about? So it can either be 200 or it can be 300. So what is 273 nearest to? So remember, because we're wanting to work out our number to the nearest 100, I need to look to the next digit, which in this case is the tens digit. So the tens digit here is a 7. Now I know that if my digit is a 7, I round up. So I know that 273 rounded to the nearest 100 is 300. Okay, now it's your turn to pause the video and have a try at these questions rounding to the nearest 100. Okay, let's see how you did. So 126 rounded to the nearest 100 is 100 because I had to look, remember, at the 2. 394, well, that's going to round to 400 because in this case I looked at the 9. 552, again I'm looking at the 5 here, so that's going to round to 600. 411, so look at the 10s, so that's a 1, so I'm going to round to 400. And 736, look at the 3 to help you, and that means I'm going to round to 700. And finally, let's think about how we can round to the nearest 1000. Okay, so let's say that we've got the number 3,261 and we want to round this to the nearest 1000. So what we do, in the same way we did before, we're looking at the next digit to the thousands. So the next digit to the thousands is the hundreds digit. So this is going to be the one that's going to help us. So we can see we've got 3,261. So we've got a 2 here. Now we know from previously that if we had a 1, a 2, a 3 or a 4, we keep with whatever we're looking at, and if we have a 5, a 6, a 7, an 8 or a 9, we round up. So with a 2, we know that we're going to stay with what we have, so that means that the nearest 1000 to 3,261 is going to be 3,000 because it's closer than 4,000. So 3,261 rounded to the nearest 1,000 is 3,000. So remember, whatever you're rounding to, look to the next digit. So let's try another one. Let's look at the number 5,724, and I want to round to the nearest 1,000, so I'm going to look at the next digit along, which is the hundreds, so that means it's the number 7 that's going to help me. Now I know with the 7, that means round up, so I know just from looking at this that 5,724 rounded to the nearest 1,000 will be 6,000, because 5,724 is closer to 6,000 than it is to 5,000. So now it's your turn to pause the video and have a try at rounding these numbers to either the nearest 10, the nearest 100 or the nearest 1,000. So let's have a look. You're going to be rounding these numbers to the nearest 10, these numbers to the nearest 100 and these numbers to the nearest 1,000. Right, pause the video and have a try. Okay, how did you find that? Let's have a look at the answers. So 58 to the nearest 10, that means we need to look at the units digit and that will help us. So 58 to the nearest 10 is 60. 64 to the nearest 10 is 60. 136, so this time remember, look at the units digit. So this will be 140, will be the nearest 10, and 422, look at the units digit, will be 420. Okay, now let's look at the nearest 100. So 125, well, for the nearest 100, remember we need to look at the tens digit. So 125 is nearest to 100. 394, let's look at the 10, so we know that 394 will be nearer to 400. 638 is going to be nearer to 600, and 533 will be nearest to 500. And now let's look at rounding numbers to the nearest 1,000. So remember, when we're rounding to the nearest 1,000, look to the next digit along, which is the hundred. So 2,126, it's going to be nearer to 2,000. 3,551, look at the hundreds, we're going to round up to 4,000. 7,424, look at the 4, so we know that's going to be 7,000. And 1,966, that's got to round up, so that's going to be nearer to 2,000. So if you made any mistakes with any of those, not to worry, just rewind the video and have a look at some of the teaching points again to remind yourself what to do.